There is a difference between a government that works for the people and a government that works for some of the people. Right now, most Americans cannot tell which one they have. That is not an accident. I want to talk about how we got here. Not from one side, from both sides. Because if we are going to be honest, and that is the only thing we do here, then honesty has to go in every direction. So let's start somewhere uncomfortable. The Democratic Party had power, real power, and they used it in ways that a significant portion of this country found not just disagreeable, but threatening. Let's be specific. The southern border was in chaos, not Republican talking points, numbers, encounters. The data was real. The images were real. Families in makeshift camps, overwhelmed processing centers, cities declaring emergencies. And the response from leadership was slow, defensive, and often dismissive of the people raising the alarm. That was a failure, a real one. Then there was the culture shift happening inside institutions, schools, corporations, media, universities. Ideas that had not been voted on, had not gone through any democratic process, were being implemented as policy. Curricula changed, language changed, HR department became ideological enforcement arms. And if you objected, if you raised your hand and said this does not reflect my values, you were not engaged. You were labeled. That is not democracy. That is imposition. And then there was the messaging. Defund the police. 3 words that handed opponents a weapon they are still using today. It did not matter what the nuanced argument behind it was. What landed, what people heard was, we are willing to remove the thing that stands between your family and chaos. In communities already dealing with violence, that was not a policy debate. That was an alarm. And underneath all of it, a tone, a posture, that if you did and if you did not hold the correct views on the correct issues in the correct way, you were not just wrong. You were backward. You were dangerous. You were the problem. Working class Americans, people who built things, who served, who followed the rules, felt looked down on. Felt like the institutions that were supposed to represent them had decided they were the obstacle. That is not a feeling manufactured by right-wing media. That is what happened. If you grew up with a strong value system, faith at the center of your home, a clear sense of right and wrong, a belief that order matters, that borders matter, that the family is the foundation of society, and you watch the institutions around you shift rapidly in directions you did not vote for, did not ask for, and could not opt out of, the feeling that something is being taken from you is real. I want to say that again clearly, that feeling is real. It is not ignorance. It is not hate. It is the feeling of a person watching something they love change in ways they did not choose and could not stop. And being told on top of that their discomfort is itself the problem. That is a particular kind of political pain, and it has consequences. And some of the reaction produced results worth acknowledging, honestly. Border encounters decreased under more aggressive enforcement policies. Some communities that were struggling with specific crime patterns saw improvement. The argument that border security had been neglected was not invented. It was documented. Those are real. They deserve to be named honestly before we examine what came next. Donald Trump was elected twice. The second time with a broader coalition than the first. More black voters, more Latino voters, more working class voters across every demographic. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen because of manipulation alone. That happens because millions of people looked at what was being offered and said, not this. That signal deserved to be heard. Not agreed with on every point, not followed without question, but heard, understood, treated as legitimate political communication from citizens who have every right to send it. Because here is what the third voice principle requires us to acknowledge. You can be completely right about what is broken and completely wrong about how to fix it. And that is exactly where we are. Feeling threatened does not authorize demonization. Winning an election does not mean the people who voted differently are your enemies. Disagreeing with progressive policy, even strongly, even passionately, does not make the other side an American. But that is the language that has entered our politics, not as frustration, as strategy. The other side is not just wrong, they are evil. They are groomers. They are globalists. They are the enemy within. They hate this country. They want to destroy everything you believe in. That framing is not an accident. It is a governing tool. And it is a dangerous one. Because once you have convinced your base that the opposition is not a political opponent, but an existential threat, you have created the conditions where anything is justified. Any method, any level of force, any disregard for process, for law, for the rights of people who are on the wrong side of that line. And that is not how you build a country. That is how you break one. Here's the constitutional reality. A government that derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed cannot govern by dividing the governed into those who matter and those who do not. That is not a progressive argument. That is not a conservative argument. That is the foundational logic of self-governance. When a government begins to treat dissent as disloyalty, when it begins to use apparatus of the state to pressure, to intimidate, to exclude, it has stopped working for the people. It is working for some of the people. And the rest of us are just living in it. I want to leave you with one question before the next episode. If the goal is legitimate, if the frustration is real, if the mandate was genuine, what does the method cost? Not politically, not strategically, constitutionally. And who pays? In the next episode, I want to show you what that cost looks like in concrete terms. Who is bearing it? Why their concerns are legitimate even when they are inconvenient. And what we, not just the politicians, have been doing to make all of this worse. Because the hardest part of this conversation is not about them. It is about us.